Hi, welcome to part three of Christmas Mysteries. And again, I'm looking at three different cameras. We are live on YouTube, on Instagram, and on Facebook. And so glad for all those who have joined us over the weeks, and that I hope today is also kind of interesting. We are getting into the question of so, what's up with the wise men? And the timing and the gifts. What's going on there? And why do we get three different names? Like there's the wise men, there are the kings, and then sometimes we hear them called magi. And you may hear me refer to them more as the magi. And what's interesting is we only find them in the book of Matthew in chapter 2. And so it's one of those places where we're going, all right, like, do we know anything more? Well, if you were to Google it, you would start to find more information about it. But what you find out is that it comes from church tradition that really starts around the 8th century. And that is because when we don't have enough information, we like to go try and search for more and try to figure out, all right, what does this mean? How does this work? Who are these guys? How many of them are there? And you may go, well, there's three, right? Because there are three gifts. But in reality, we actually don't know. We know that the Magi show up, that they have traveled to get there, and we get some sense of, well, how long was it? Like, was it how old was Jesus? Was it right after the birth? And that comes later in the story. So if you were to read through Matthew 2 past the Magi, it would say something about Herod. And King Herod is the guy who he's in charge of the area. He is not over Caesar. Caesar allows him to have the term king, but Herod is known for cruelty. And so anything that could touch his power that is a threat to him, he is going to eradicate. And so when the Magi show up, they're like, hey, we followed this star and we're looking for the king of the Jews who's been born. And Herod's like, what? And because it's not him. And so he calls in the scribes, he calls in the legal experts, and he's like, where is this child to be born? Comes up Bethlehem. And Herod tells the wise men, he's like, all right, you guys go and honor the child, and then I'm going to follow. And the Magi, they go on to Bethlehem. They go and they bring these gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And the gold is meant to symbolize wealth, royalty, also very helpful for newer parents. And then you get frankincense, which is also uh, the incense, but it has healing properties. It has antibacterial properties. There's many different kinds that are actually grown in Oman, and they even are using it in cancer research. So a whole lot of healing properties with frankincense, which they would have known about, some of those in that time. And then myrrh, which also has some healing properties. It's an antiseptic, but it was also used as anointing with the high priest. And it was also used at the time of embalming. And so we actually find out at the time of the resurrection that the women have brought spices, and part of that is myrrh to prepare Jesus' body. And so as they bring that, they honor the child because that's what they're there for. That's what they have followed the star for. So I see that. Did they know each other before the star? We have no idea whether or not the wise men, the magi, knew each other before the star. Church tradition has them, they start naming them. And one of the names is Melchior, and he's said to be the king of Persia. And then the other is Casper, and he's the king of India. And then we get Balthazar, which is the king of Arabia. We don't know any of that. Those are just stories that are told to try to figure out, where did they come from? How did they know to journey together? Or did they? We're not sure if they knew each other before. But they make this journey. Some have said, well, maybe they're coming from Persia, which has a religion of Zoroastrian. And the Zoroastrian religion is a single deity religion, much like Judaism. And so maybe there is a connection there. There would also be a practice of astrology. And so they're looking at the stars. They think something special. And it's interesting because the stars, like people go, well, was there anything at the time actually going on in right in astronomy to make somebody go, we need to follow that? And there are a couple of instances. One is that Halley's Comet came through in 12 BCE. And so for those who remember Halley's Comet from the 1970s, that would have been something spectacular for people to see at the time. There's also something where Jupiter and Saturn come into, they're seen together and they're very bright, and it happens 3 times in 7 BCE. So then there you get a sense of, okay, well, maybe they're seeing something there. We don't know exactly when they see it, but when they get to Herod, they speak about it. Herod gets a sense of that. And then after the Magi leave, and then he realizes the Magi have fooled him and not come back to tell him anything about where to find the child, that he goes about killing all of the children 2 years and down. So says the story. And so you go, all right, well, then something must have been said when the Magi were talking about when they first saw the star and how long it took them to journey for Herod to take that action of all the male children 2 years and down. So don't totally know. The star, it's kind of interesting to think about the star in a sense. I remember my New Testament professor going, if there was a star blinking directly over a house, I think we'd probably go knock on the house, right? Knock on the door and go, is everything okay? What's going on in here? But something is directing them to say something special happening in this way, which is also why they show up to Herod to get a little bit more information, because they don't know exactly where they are going. All right, let's see. We got another question. How far did they travel? We really aren't sure, but they could have been traveling for months. They could have been traveling weeks. They could have been traveling months, just because we don't know how far, but in the ancient world, right, they're walking. And so it's going to take time wherever they are headed to get there. And it's not always safe. So thinking about how many of them, there's actually a tradition of over in more the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, that there are 12. And that kind of makes sense that there would be more than 3, because you need protection. The bigger the caravan, the more the protection. So to think about that in terms is kind of cool as well. There's also a couple of times, right, where we were talking about they get named different things: Magi, wise men, and kings. And that term for Magi is based upon the Greek word magoi, which gets translated as wise. So you get that connection. But then by the Middle Ages, you actually get this whole notion of kings. And that comes from a couple of places. And one of them, really, it comes from a couple places in this passage out of Isaiah 60, where it's talking about, arise, your light has shined. So think about, they're thinking the star. But at the end, it says, nations will come to your light and kings to your dawning radiance. So you start to get a sense of, oh, okay, maybe they could be kings. It also gets that story forms because of what they're bringing, right? The gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So they obviously have resources to be able to bring those things. All right, other questions as we're going through. All right. So I do want to point out something else kind of interesting. How did they know to get to Bethlehem? How did Herod do that? Well, when he calls in the chief scribes and the experts, they quote something out of Micah 5:2. As for you, Bethlehem of Ephrathah, though you are the least significant of Judah's forces, one who is to be a ruler of Israel on my behalf will come out from you. His origin is from remote times, from ancient days. So that's how we get the Magi being directed by Herod to Bethlehem, because they come in and are like, well, if somebody's going to be born and they're supposed to be special, that's where. And Bethlehem, where it says least significant of Judah's forces, the Bethlehem is part of the tribe of Benjamin, which was the smallest of all the tribes. Benjamin was also the son of Jacob, who was the youngest. And so it's this sense of they are small in number, but they have great significance, because also from the tribe of Benjamin comes King David, which is part of Jesus' lineage through Joseph. And so there we have a little bit of connection of, even though we think we're not so important, we can still, great things can come from us. All right, other questions we got coming in? I think we've got.
How long did they stay in Bethlehem?
How long did they stay in Bethlehem? The Magi seem to kind of get there, like the story goes, they're there, and then they immediately like turn around and go. You go, wow, like months of travel possibly, and you stayed like 6 hours, like an hour. We aren't totally certain how long they stayed, but they stayed long enough. Their purpose was to honor the child, which is kind of interesting to think about, that these individuals were so moved by the possibility of honoring someone, of honoring a child, that they make this journey and they do what they can in those few moments. And then they are warned in a dream to not go back to Herod. And so they go back to their country a different way. So says the story. And to think about how we honor others, or what makes us want to honor others or show respect or dignity, it's kind of cool to think about, of how they take this moment to honor, to respect, show dignity to a child that we know the rest of the story, but they don't know the rest of the story. They just know something is different and something, there's a lot of potential there. Other questions? All right. Well, I hope this has been helpful. If you've ever had questions about the Magi, the wise men, the kings, whatever you want to call them, they usually get celebrated on Epiphany, which is January 6th, which is the 12th day of Christmas. In some religious traditions, that's the day you get gifts, not necessarily Christmas. And that's the time to recognize how they were recognizing Jesus with what they had, with the resources they had, with their time especially, and how Jesus is representing, incorporating people that are outside of the religion of Judaism, that are outside his home country, that is much broader than could have ever been expected. We kind of talked about that in the in-person Bible study earlier this afternoon, about how in this moment that Jesus, even as a small child, maybe up to 2 years old, is drawing together people that otherwise may have never come together, drawing together from far outside those that one may have said, well, I expect my neighbors to show up, and he's drawing from many others. All right. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you have a Merry Christmas.